we're excited to hear from you today.
Empathy in the context of technology. So I think many of us were working either 100% or at least some percentage remote during the pandemic for an extended period of time. And it's really a generational difference, I think, to be able to connect with people socially well in the context of technology. So many of us were like introduced to heavy use of Zoom, heavy use of Slack, heavy use of lots of tools that we didn't necessarily have to entirely rely on in order to communicate, to onboard new employees, to mentor, to coach, and suddenly we were sort of forced to do that. And so understanding how to leverage technology tools in a very fundamental way and still be able to relay empathy as a leader, I think is also a skill set, a critical skill set. One of the things that people are very excited about with ChatGPT is workforce productivity. And that strikes fear into a lot of people's hearts because oftentimes when you hear workforce productivity, you assume that it's code for layoffs, right? But there's really kind of two ways to think about this. Going back to kind of what we said earlier, there's an opportunity and a risk associated with every decision. The decision to use generative AI or something like ChatGPT or any other like similar tool in your workforce, you could actually think of it as an opportunity to get virtual workforce for free without having to hire more people, or you could think of it as a way to kind of try to streamline people's jobs so that you need less workers. I prefer the former rather than the latter, at least right now, for two reasons. One is that we don't fully know how to get the most out of this technology in terms of collaboration, meaning that you could sort of pull an Elon Musk and try to fire like 75% of your company and just have generative AI do everything. But it tends to not work out so well, as we're seeing, and some real life examples. Compliance is something that tends to suffer. Ethics is something that tends to suffer. There are a lot of things that go into human judgment that are required. But on the flip side, I do think that in consideration of what these tools can do, you also have to have some element of workforce training that accompanies it. And so those two things have to go hand in hand. It's an investment in the technology. It's also an investment in the workforce. And the best way to reap the benefits of those two investments is to actually retain as much as you can of both. And so that's why I think it's better to actually see it as a way to virtually enhance the productivity of the workforce that you have for free, because there's a learning curve and it's going to take some time. The other thing that I will say that these tools can really do well is allow you to take a lot of data from a whole bunch of different sources and combine it. So one of the things that creates friction in collaboration is that oftentimes teams, even when they're very well formed, even when they have great norms, even when they work well together, they suffer from something called kind of a groupthink. You can also think of it as, I think it's called Einstellung effect or something like that, which is basically kind of, you get used to thinking of doing things in a particular way. So for me, I'll use my own real life example. I got to Atlanta yesterday and didn't have my luggage. So I had to get really creative about how I was going to kind of do the things that I normally do. I didn't have lotion, so I had to use sunscreen. I didn't have, for folks who know what I'm talking about, I didn't have a head wrap last night, so I had to like use the top of my, the top half of a nightgown set that I had. Like just crazy things. Like I was getting really, really innovative with just like what I could do with the materials that I had, because half of my stuff didn't show up. And I had to go buy new shoes, I had to figure out what I was gonna wear, like all of these things. The functional use case of a particular thing that we buy as a product or a service oftentimes kind of puts us into a mindset that it has to work this way. Generative AI is actually really good at finding other ways to approach the same problem and giving you ideas that are either tangential or radically different depending on how you prompt it. And then without having to kind of take the risk because we as people tend to not want to be divergent from a group, and so that's why the groupthink is a real problem in terms of how companies innovate. You can have the tools start to take the risks and then have people engage in a dialogue about, okay, well, this is an idea that we've never considered before. We don't have to throw anyone under the bus, about it. Like, let's just consider how it might actually foster a better outcome or a better result or something new that we hadn't considered exploring in the past. Generative AI as a strategic tool is really, really key, I think, for the C-suite and the workplace. But going back to what we said before, still have to consider the ethics, still have to see it as both an opportunity and a risk. Large companies typically have an innovation practice where there's sort of an offense and a defense. The offense is more so, how can we be exploratory and think about using our data in ways that will help us to gain a competitive advantage in a new market, come up with a new product, et cetera, et cetera. And then they have a defensive strategy, which is kind of, how do we protect the data that we have? How do we answer basic questions with dashboards and metrics? Are we doing KPIs? Is the data that we're using for our KPIs aligned across different departments? Are we using OKRs? Do the OKRs make sense? Are we achieving our goals? Do the people who are responsible for achieving goals actually have the ability to get the data that they need, et cetera, et cetera? That is a very standard framework, and it works really well. But the reason why, in my view, if people are familiar with the innovator's dilemma, the reason why large companies oftentimes get kind of disrupted by startups is because startups think about using data completely differently. And so I'll highlight that right now as my sort of closing point. Startups think about data from the perspective of the exploratory side first, because they literally have no kind of legacy operation to worry about and manage, from a metric, data, aggregation, OKR, KPI, does everybody have access, et cetera. There's very little kind of like technical debt. So they start from the point of exploration and they say, how can we actually get to a place where we can develop a new product, a new service that's highly in demand and kind of reimagines, something that functions in a way that is subpar from the user or the consumer's point of view. So what does that sound like based on kind of our conversation so far this morning? What does that remind you? What is that reminiscent of that we discussed earlier? It sounds like kind of the same thing that we do with the generative AI, right? Like, the idea is to actually figure out a way to take data and be more exploratory, more collaborative with it. And so I guess the point that I'm trying to hit home is, if you really want to get to a place where you can be strategically innovative with data in your organization, doesn't matter if you're a large enterprise or a startup, the advantage is always going to go to the one who is being more exploratory, more sort of thinking outside the box, as they would say. And the tools that generative AI give us actually accelerate that. So that's the #1 reason why I want everybody in this room, if you haven't already started to play around with it, to go home tonight and start playing around with the ChatGPT and sort of generative AI tools. There's a whole bunch out there. ChatGPT is the most well-known one. But figure out a way that you can incorporate this into your work, into your children's education, into the way that your organization is accomplishing tasks. Learn it, because it really is fundamentally going to change the way that we think about everything, and it's going to actually be the difference between whether your company, your organization is innovative and ultimately is going to survive or not. And the extent to which we can sort of create these opportunities of new ideas, enhanced collaboration, and idea generation, it's only going to serve us well. Also, we definitely, just as a country, need to make sure that we are staying ahead of the game. And this is something that we really need to get a hold of. I think it's an incremental step change in the way that we think and do business. So anyway, thank you.